So one example from chapter 2 to pay attention to is a Bushman 2002 example. So in this study, your textbook uses this study to show how research is better than experience, right? So in this study, the researcher Bushman um, really took to task this theory of catharsis, the idea that there's some benefit to release of pent up emotion, right? So, for example, anger. Get out the anger, have a cathartic moment, and then you should feel better. You should not have anger, or you should have processed that anger in a way that now you should feel better. So he decided to test this out and see, well, is this actually true? Bushman recruited 600 university students to test this out and had them do a political essay. And then all the students received feedback from who they believed was another student, right? They received feedback on their essays. It was very negative feedback. And the reason why it had to be negative was to get the students to feel a negative and a strong emotion towards this Confederate, it turns out, whose name was Steve. Now, a Confederate in a psychology study is somebody who's part of the research team, but the participant doesn't know that they're part of the research team, right? So these participants are getting this feedback, very negative feedback. They're getting worked up because they think somebody's making them feel, that's being very critical of their writing. And if you think back to your own writing and getting feedback, we get defensive. It hurts to get feedback on our writing. Some checks in place just to make sure the participants had not guessed that Steve was a Confederate, and to make sure that they actually felt some anger, right? So this was the design. So in this design, you had 3 groups. So the key one to pay attention to is group 3. Group 3 is this catharsis group, right? They were told, punch this punching bag. There's take out all your anger towards Steve. There's a picture of Steve on the punching bag, and right, this is the idea, like let's let them have their anger moment, get that anger out, and see if there's benefits to that participant. And now skipping back to group 1 and 2, group 1 simply sat quietly for 2 minutes. So keep in mind, these are different people. 200 in group 1, 200 in group 2, 200 in group 3. Group 1 sits quietly for 2 minutes. Group 2 does some exercise, right, to see if exercise alone might lead to some differences in the DV. And group 3, this was the catharsis group, right? Now let's see if there were any benefits. So remember, we're comparing these 3 groups. They only experienced one of these situations. And here they standardize the data, so don't get too hung up on what this bar graph looks like. Just keep in mind that the sat quietly was the lowest in terms of the DV. And just to point out the DV was subsequent aggression to the partner, right? So they either sat in a chair quietly, either did some exercise, or were told to get their anger out towards Steve, right? Then afterwards, they had an opportunity to blast the Confederate with a loud noise, right? This is like their form of aggression, because in a study, ethically, we can't have them do real aggression or think they're doing real aggression. So this is the closest we can get. You're blasting in a loud noise in Steve's ear, that's a DV, and we're looking at how loud they actually blasted that sound. Now keep in mind that this didn't actually happen to Steve. The participants did think it was happening though. So for the participants who sat quietly, that was the lowest, right? In terms of how loud or for how long they played the sound, this hurtful sound in Steve's ear. The punching bag was in between, but by far the highest group was the group that got to take out their anger towards Steve. Now keep in mind, this theory of catharsis claims that there's some benefit. It helps you process the emotion. But here we're finding, well, it seems like the people who had this cathartic moment were the most aggressive. It didn't really help them process that aggression. They actually were more aggressive than if they did nothing. So maybe this theory of catharsis, at least based on these findings, doesn't really hold it doesn't hold its ground in terms of the data, right? So this should get us to reflect on our ideas and really question, well, is this theory of catharsis something we should really continue to use and apply in how we do therapy, for example? So this example just goes to show that we might have some ideas that intuitively make sense to us, but when we actually do an experiment, do the data, challenge that theory or that held notion, we might find that that actually doesn't work out the way we expected, as you see here. So keep that in mind. You had 3 groups. They were all made angry. Let me actually move back. One group sat quietly. Another group of students had an opportunity to get some exercise in. And group 3 had the cathartic moment. When we compare all 3 groups, the lowest group was the people who sat quietly. Maybe they ended up meditating for a bit. And between you have the exercise group, and the most violent group was a group that had the punching bag with Steve's face on it, right? That had this cathartic moment. So keep that in mind, right? Keep these findings in mind, and keep in mind how you had this existing notion or theory of how processing emotion worked. You had an experiment that challenged that theory. Now you have findings that should really make us go back to that theory and change it, modify it to fit our findings, or maybe we create a new theory based on these findings.